Well, welcome back, everybody. So, next session, future challenges to the Union, and we have Arthur Aughey on my far left, who, perhaps not coincidentally, is one of the great writers about Englishness, and is from Northern Ireland. And to my immediate left is Lord Murphy of Torfaen, who has the remarkable record of being both former Secretary of State for Wales and Northern Ireland. And to my right is Maurice Glasman, founder of Blue Labour. So in this session, we are going to obviously address what we've been talking about already today, some of the challenges to the Union from devolution, from Brexit, from Scottish nationalism. But I hope we can also kind of broaden the discussion a little bit to what one might call the challenge to the Union from the spirit of the age, the post-national, individualistic, identity politics spirit, particularly of our great metropolitan centres, where national belonging of any kind is often considered something rather bizarre and old-fashioned. But anyway, let's hear first from Arthur, I think, on the more obvious and immediate challenges to the Union.
Thank you very much, David. When I was asked to do this, I thought I might try and do three things. What I think would be distinctive about English nationalism, even if there is such a thing, where it might be, or what the factors might be that would encourage it, and perhaps more speculatively, where it is going. Well, 15 years ago, when I began research on the subject, I wangled an invitation to the AGM of the Campaign for an English Parliament, which was being held in Conway Hall in London. And because I didn't know at the time where Conway Hall was, I arrived relatively early. And I stumbled upon a room which had a number of people milling about in it drinking tea, and my immediate prejudice and assumption and stereotype was, well, it must be the Campaign for an English Parliament. So my first question to this group was, Campaign for an English Parliament? And they looked at me and said, no, we're the London Haiku Society. But when I actually finally did find the AGM, the attendance wasn't really that much higher than those who were in the London Haiku Society. Now, they were all very decent, serious, and intelligent individuals who were talking very constructively and intelligently about the politics of the Union and about England. But as I left Conway Hall later, I remembered that famous plaque on its wall, the home of lost causes. And why did I think that? Well, it wasn't that I thought they didn't have a clear argument, because it was admitted that England was the great gaping hole in the devolution settlement, and they were proposing an alternative. But I thought that because of the whole intellectual and academic hinterland of thought about England, Englishness, and English nationalism. I mean, 50 years ago, Richard Rose, who really began and pioneered the study of territorial politics in the UK, Richard Rose famously proposed that England was a state of mind and not a consciously organised political entity. And Rose's conclusion 50 years ago was that, well, you could write of politics in England, but the politics of England were British. And Rose didn't think that was a problem, and he didn't think it was a problem because of the size of England and the size of the English population. And he wrote in that book, what is important for England will never be overlooked. 20 years ago, with devolution now to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, the English still seem to agree. The polls at the time, around 1997 into the early noughties, could be described as an English attitude of complacence or acceptance. Well, if the Scots and the Welsh and the Northern Irish want devolution, well, fair play to them. We're happy as we are. 10 years ago, I cooperated with Robert Hazel of the Constitution Unit on a book called The English Question. And Robert Hazel's conclusion to that book at the time represented a general academic consensus, because he famously remarked in that conclusion, well, look, if there is such a thing as the English question, the English don't need to come up with an answer to it. I thought that was a very good response at the time. And equally, the anthropologist Susan Condor, who did a lot of work on this subject about English attitudes, when she considered the rather dramatic newspaper headlines of a forthcoming English backlash to devolution, she said this: ordinary English people, according to her evidence of discussing it with him, ordinary English people by and large remain stubbornly galvanized into inaction. Now that's Willie Whitelaw territory, that English nationalists were going around stirring the country up into apathy. And that seemed to be a good judgment of the condition, well, 10, 15 years ago. So I wrote at the time in the book that English nationalism, insofar as it existed, was a mood and not a movement. And of course, moods can change. Now, Professor Kidd mentioned this morning about graffiti and the bus station in Glasgow. Well, I recall what Roy Hattersley once said about his first trip to Edinburgh as a young politician. He said, at the time, Scottish nationalism was an old lady giving away leaflets in Princes Street on a wet Saturday night. And now we know what Scottish nationalism is. But is there any evidence that English nationalism is changing from a mood into a movement? Is there any evidence that it might be going in the direction to strength of Scotland or even perhaps Wales? And let me take you back then a century ago, 100 years ago, when Sir Ernest Barker, in that famous book on national character, remarked, ironically it seems to be, on the difference between Scotland and England. And he said this: what was distinctive about Scottish nationhood was its lack of separate governing institutions. And Barker explained what was distinctive about England by inversion. He said this: England is embodied, or Englishness is embodied in the system of institutions such that English nationality is never reflective, because it is simply and so obviously a fact. Well, in the last decade, it would seem that orthodoxy has been challenged. And I think it's been challenged from two different directions. Firstly, it's been challenged by those who say that it reflects, or that view of complacence reflects the curse of the sentimentality of Westminster, and secondly, loss of control to Brussels. So if there is a nationalistic English voice, what might it be saying? Well, it might say this: that while England and the English unreflectively subscribe to the pieties of parliamentary sovereignty and Westminster across the road, devolution now works against the English. That's the Emily Thornbury factor, if you like, the cross of St. George hanging out the window. That if there is self-determination in the Union with devolution, it's the Scots and the Welsh who get the self-determination, and it's the English who get to subsidise them. And secondly, the EU has sucked power out of that system of institutions, as Theresa Villiers was mentioning today, and that is, I suppose, the Brexit Englishness that others have mentioned. So in play, to sort of sum this up, I think there are three related factors to understand where this may be coming from. And the first concerns what Jim Pulpit famously called British statecraft. And he said, according to the British governing perspective, despite what the Scots and the Welsh and the Irish may have thought, for British politicians at the centre, England was never at the centre of their perspective. From the perspective of Westminster and Whitehall, England was simply another part of the periphery. And that just doesn't mean in the wonderful city of Hull or in Sunderland, but also in parts of London. England was not at the centre of that British governing perspective at all. It was something else entirely. And the second concerns, I suppose, institutional trust that Barker takes for granted. Because Vernon Bogdaner believed that the old efficient secret of government at Westminster depended on public trust in those institutions and in those personalities. And of course, that trust has been partly eroded with the disaffection with the Westminster elite that we all know about. And then the third concerns institutional identity. Well, if the UK has changed, if there has been devolution, then perhaps the exclusively British character of English institutions needs to be rethought. So putting all of those points together, what might be the core of a possible English nationalism? Well, it's this. If the rest of the UK enjoys forms of self-government, if Westminster speaks for the Union, then, as Roger Scruton puts it, England is now forbidden. It does not have a voice, and England now needs a voice. And modifications through English votes and English laws do not go far enough. So in conclusion, have you reached a moment of English nationalism? Well, I don't think so. I think it still remains a mood, but I think that mood is much more widespread and expressed in political forms which have a much wider impact than those I met at the Campaign for an English Parliament AGM at Conway Hall. In the Labour Party, with John Denham, amongst others, even the Constitutional Reform Group, which includes that great unionist Lord Salisbury, who are arguing perhaps for a federal solution to the United Kingdom, especially post-Brexit. I think England and the problem of England now really does need to be taken seriously. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, a very good afternoon to you. The very interesting 10 or 15 minutes then, which got me thinking about some things I hadn't intended to say to you, but I might possibly say as a consequence of your contribution. In the Times today, there's a very interesting article about Ireland, Northern Ireland, in connection with, obviously, the Brexit debate and the border. And it concludes quite rightly that the Good Friday Agreement, which I had some part in dealing with 20 years ago, was talking about parity of esteem of people in Northern Ireland. And it is all about identity, but you can be British and Irish, as well as being British and Welsh, and British and Scottish, and all sorts of combinations of those. I'm a living example of it. I'm a former Secretary of State for Wales with a surname which is more Irish than any other surname. I'm part Welsh, I'm part English by ancestry, and obviously part Irish. And held the two jobs of Secretary for Wales and Northern Ireland, but not Scotland. Two of my colleagues here, Alistair and Jim, held that job. But it is quite possible to be able to combine identities in a way that we saw dramatically over the last 20 years in Northern Ireland. But I'm here to talk not about that, but about Wales and what the significance of unionism and nationalism is in that country. And it is different from Scotland, considerably. The Welsh nationalist movement is linguistic, cultural, economic to a certain extent, but all the Plaid Cymru seats tend to be in the north and to the west of Wales, which are generally speaking, but not exclusively, Welsh-speaking. 20% of Welsh people speak the Welsh language. But other than some examples of where they did well really as a protest party in South Wales, where the majority of people live, and North East Wales, the other big centre of population, they haven't done very well at all. And over the years we've had a number of referenda in Wales on devolution. The first one was in 1978. And I was treasurer of the Labour No Assembly campaign in those days. I didn't want devolution. I regarded myself as a proud Welshman, but also a part of the United Kingdom. And I believed that there should have been some sort of federal solution where we have devolution everywhere, including in the regions of England, which in my view then was something that could actually stop nationalism. It wasn't to be the case. The then Wilson-Callaghan government decided that they wanted devolution for Wales. They set up the commission. They did, obviously, for Scotland too, where the threat was bigger to our union. And in Wales, the referendum lost dramatically. In the valley seats in South Wales, in mine, for example, it was almost 10-1 against devolution. And so for nearly 2 decades, Wales didn't have any form of devolution. There was, of course, administrative, executive devolution. There was a Secretary of State for Wales, there was a Welsh office, but there was no Welsh Assembly. The world then changed 20 years later, and in 1997, with the return of the Labour government, it was decided, as you know, to have referenda in Scotland, in Wales, and also, as a consequence of the Good Friday Agreement, in Northern Ireland. The result in Wales was a very, very narrow win for devolution. My own constituency of Torfaen, in those days, it still decided to vote against devolution. But the South Wales valleys changed. There's 1 million people live in there, and they completely changed to come to support devolution, partly because it was in the wake of a successful Labour victory at the general election, but also because Quangos had grown up in Wales and they were very unpopular, as indeed I suppose Mrs. Thatcher was too. So a combination of all those things meant that devolution actually then came to Wales, but it was a narrow victory. And the situation since 1997, for 20 years, is that the Assembly actually has grown, if you like, more popular amongst Welsh people. It's accepted an awful lot more, to such an extent that some years ago we had another referendum, this time to give the Welsh Assembly greater powers, and overwhelmingly that referendum agreed. I would never have thought myself 10, 20, 30 years ago that that would happen, that the Welsh people voluntarily would say we want more powers for our Assembly, but they did. And one wonders why that occurred. I think, in my view, that devolution actually saves the Union. It strengthens it. My original doubts about it, and Alistair and Jim and others would talk about the Scottish experience, but my Welsh experience tells me that successful devolution over the last 20 years has meant that people can actually differentiate between having a government and parliament here in Westminster and one in Cardiff as well. My fears, 40 years ago almost now, was that the opposite would be the case, that devolution would be the slippery slope to independence and the destruction of the Union. From a Welsh perspective, that wasn't to be the case. And all the opinion polls that we have in Wales indicate that people don't want the end of the Union. They want Wales to be part of it, but also want Wales to be part of a devolution system where many powers are now coming to the Welsh Assembly. And indeed, over the last few months, indeed only last week, in Parliament, in the House of Lords, we were debating the impact of Brexit on devolution, and the government, as you probably know, has agreed a settlement with the Welsh government on where we are after Brexit, but not with the Scottish government, unsurprisingly. So has devolution strengthened the Union? I think it can do. I think there had to be a recognition of the different constituent parts of our country. The devolution settlement is asymmetrical. It's different in all parts in Northern Ireland, in Wales and in Scotland. And I think as a consequence of it, the pressure then on what happens to England now becomes acute. I was deeply opposed to having separate solutions in Parliament on voting, the so-called English laws and English voting, deeply, and still am. No such thing occurs in the House of Lords. In the House of Lords, we vote because we are members of the House of Lords. In my view, that's to say, it should be the case in the House of Commons. I was elected as a member of the British Parliament, not of the Welsh Parliament, and there is no other example anywhere in Europe, as far as I know, beyond that, where there is a differential voting system because you happen to have devolution in the part of the country you live in. I think that weakens the union. I think that the reduction of Welsh and Scottish members of Parliament and Northern Ireland MPs weaken the union, because it means that people see that sooner or later, perhaps, there will be independence in these other parts, with which I would fundamentally disagree. So I think that we are at a very interesting point. We have no assembly or executive in Belfast, of course. That's a great tragedy. We've heard Arlene Foster this morning. That's got to come back. But Scotland and Wales still, in different ways, still very much part of the union. We should cherish it. But we do it by ensuring that devolution is now enshrined in the public mind, but also, back to England, the big question mark. 10 million of us live in devolved parts of the United Kingdom. It's an unequal struggle if you're a Welsh or Scottish or Northern Ireland person in politics. People say, you've got all the advantages. Of course you haven't got the advantages. Go to that place over there in the House of Commons, you're outvoted every time by English members of Parliament. So I don't think there's any great problem arising for England out of it, but that's for another debate.
Mm-hmm. Maurice.
Thank you, David, and thank you for the invitation. And it's wonderful to be on a panel, very unusual, of people who actually know what they're talking about. So really a pleasure to be here. I think we are living in a constitutional moment to think about that. But just first, as Policy Exchange pretends to be some kind of think tank, I'll come up with a first policy, and however difficult it is for you, Jim, is that I think the first thing is to offer 2 places in the Premier League for Scottish clubs. Yeah, well, and there's the Catholic Protestant sectarian divide reasserting itself again, which was of course one of the roots of the incredible loyalty to Labour in the Scottish Catholic vote, was fear of a non-secular sort of Gordon Brown figure.
Just sent an English Catholic to manage drinks.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter, David. So, but the point being there, we've got to think about the integration of national systems once more. I do think that the renationalisation of the railways gives an opportunity to do things like that, to reintegrate the national institutions in which each part of the union participates. So there's a real work of the imagination. Obviously, it doesn't take much imagination to realise what would happen to Rangers. They'd be relegated because they're no good, and then they'd be relegated again for financial irregularities. But they would return, I'm sure, and that would stop the almost Soviet monotony, the Brezhnevite, you could say, monotony of Celtic dominion. You know, when they lose against, for example, Cardiff. So I think that's one thing that we do have to talk about. Secondly, Arthur mentioned Lord Salisbury, and had an interesting conversation with him in relation to Brexit. I had no idea who he was, but he wandered up to me in the Lords and asked me a very difficult question. He said, "When was the Reformation?" There you go. And I kind of mumbled and said 1537, and he said, "That'll do." And he said, "And when was the Armada?" And that I knew from bingo reasons, 1588. It's a memorable date. And he said, "So you see, Brexit took 50 years last time." And I think that we've got to take that historical perspective, that there'll be loads of ups and downs along the ways, and this and that and the other. But it's very important to say that that period, 1535 was actually the correct answer, to 1588 was the greatest period of constitutional reform in English history. You had the rest of the counties, the reaffirmation of the county hundreds, the assertion of the common law, the creation of a national grammar school system. You had the endowment of the Cambridge in particular, but also Oxford colleges, particularly with a specialism in maths, in Greek, in Hebrew and Latin, the translation of the Bible. You had the establishment of the Royal Exchange. You had the establishment of the maritime centre in Greenwich, both in relation to naval technology and in relation to map making. Essentially, in a century, England had transformed itself from a European backwater into a leading naval nation with a body politic that had been reconstituted in fundamental ways. So I think we're at that moment, that constitutional moment where we have to think about the offer as well and the nature of the union. I completely agree with Lord Murphy that Parliament needs to be renewed and the unity of Parliament, as well as there are particular issues relating to the common law in England that need to be renewed. But the problem that we have to confront is a lack of democratic power in the places that people live. So in the name of transparency and honesty, I have to say that I participated, a great deal in Labour's 2015 manifesto, if you remember that one, Jim. That big winning manifesto in Scotland in particular. And I worked on it with John Cruddas, and we didn't have too much leeway. So one of the things that we did was we ran a survey asking, and this was overwhelmingly in England, where people thought they lived, just a sense of place. And the astonishing thing is that where they lived corresponded almost exactly, and this was immigrants and locals, it was all people, to the parish map of the 1520s than it did to the present administrative map. For example, no one answered that they lived in Medway. No one answered that they lived in South Humberside. No one really answered that they lived in Hackney or Tower Hamlets. People answered according to their parish, where they lived, the actual place or their village, or their town, and they answered according to their county, that this still had enormous power over people, and people resented the fact that there'd been so much administrative mucking around with counties. It was still very much alive, and then they lived in a country. This was overwhelmingly England, which was within Great Britain. So I think that we have to start thinking about democracy and fulfilling that idea. And thinking constitutionally, I think devolution always sounds administrative. It sounds like an administrative devolution. We have to think, so for example, we have to look at the endowment of regional and local banks. There's been a complete, we talk about the centralisation of political power, but there's been an enormous centralisation of capital and economic power. So for example, none of the building societies that were demutualised in the 80s and the early 90s exist as autonomous organisations anymore. So in other words, there's been a depletion of capital and assets from the regions, which means that they're simultaneously dependent on the City of Westminster in terms of project money and political power and taxation, and the City of London in terms of going, so a redistribution of assets and the establishment of institutions that are rooted in their area. As the delegate, you lived through the trauma of Northern Rock and what happened with Northern Rock, but the story of that is allegorical as well as real. It started life as a beautiful name. It was the Northern Counties Permanent Building Society, established in 1834 by local people. Everybody put in a very modest mutual society that endured through 5 depressions, was deeply embedded in the area. One example would be that during the miners' strike in the 80s, and Dominic's dad wouldn't have been so happy about this, but they suspended mortgage payments for striking miners so they wouldn't lose their homes. It was embedded in the northeast and was a very trusted, it had a philanthropic wing which helped students there go to university. Now the point is, it merged in 1964 with another institution, the other local building society, which was called The Rock, to become Northern Rock. And it was demutualised in the symbolic year of 1997. And the reality is that all of those assets were completely squandered and depleted from the area. And now this is experienced as a loss, as a huge loss and a dispossession. So one of the things that we've been putting forward as part of a post-Brexit analysis is that 5% of the bailout should be used to endow local banks so that people can have some access to capital. There's other areas which David was alluding to, the decimation of vocational education and the increase in higher education as a form of social mobility. Social mobility, something that I always define as the greatest distance possible you can live from your mother, is the success of social mobility. And the point being is that not everybody wants to go away and go to university, and there's a lack of respect for manual skills. So building of vocational colleges is another example of institutional decentralization of power within a framework where people have affection for the places. One of the most excellent referendums we had, which nobody seems to remember, is the massive rejection of proportional representation, so that the House of Commons still represents people from places rather than from party lists. So the offer that's got to be made to the people is greater democracy, greater power over their lives, and that's the crucial thing in relation to the SNP. And I think it's stymied slightly, but it can't be that Edinburgh alone holds the power. There's got to be a decentralisation of power throughout the kingdom to the obvious places to which people hold affection, to their cities and to their counties. But I would go further. What came out of this study we did about where people thought they lived was a very strong commitment to essentially the parish. So I'm working on this concept of a parish commune, where issues relating to housing and education can be sorted out through local assemblies and direct elections in those areas. So essentially, I completely agree with Arthur. I also got invitations from the campaign for an English Parliament, and it was a bit like the Fabians in the early 90s. It wasn't really galvanised by a tremendous energy or turnout, but neither was it threatening in any way. It was thinking about this issue. But I think you're right. We'll see in the World Cup coming up, people, invariably, if you read The Guardian, you will read about the warnings of a terrible and awful nationalism, but it will disappear, I think, probably by the quarterfinals. And that will dissipate as if it never was. It will be, in other words, a mood rather than a movement. And the desire that I hear from people is to honour the traditions of the country, that is, the democratic traditions of parliamentary representation, the legal traditions relating to the common law, but also to honour the most neglected of those which has fallen by the way, which is a genuine form of local self-government built around corporations. So, you know, the city corporations, vocational corporations, universities as self-governing institutions. So in fact, the ancient constitution is alive in that sense, a sense of the balance of interests within the polity. So, to conclude, what I would say is that what Arthur called the periphery, they voted for Brexit. The people of England, essentially outside the major metropolitan centres, overwhelmingly voted for Brexit in order to assert some democratic control over forces of globalisation and of a different system, a Napoleonic system, which was based on directives and which had no internal system of accountability or of democracy. But in order to reconstitute the nation and the union, I think it's essential to grasp that this should be based on a genuine decentralisation of power, and to view Parliament as the apex of a body politic, so a renewal of the body politic, and not an exclusive power residing simply in the head. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I want to ask a couple of questions. So, I mean, much of the post-Brexit debate certainly in Scotland and parts of Northern Ireland has been fear of that the Brexit vote has been seen to some extent as an expression of low-level English nationalism, and it has aroused that fear of overmighty England, the carelessness of overmighty England. And yet we all seem to be up here saying that this is an unjustified fear, that, I mean, at worst, you might say it was an expression of democratic English nationalism of a perfectly legitimate kind. After all, the one party that might be said to represent English nationalism doesn't even have England in its title, has the United Kingdom in its title. So if there isn't an Englishness to fear, there isn't even an Englishness to give voice to either, is what we seem to be saying. I mean, there's no great interest in devolution within England, or some sort of Englishness expressed in Parliament. I mean, as Morris was saying, it may just be Englishness is expressed through localism, or perhaps through mayors. So there isn't an English issue, really. Is that what we're saying? Yeah.
Well, I think that this is a long-standing debate. Dicey's been mentioned frequently throughout today, in Dicey's famous book, England's Case Against Home Rule, which was really England's case against Ireland, Irish Home Rule. But Dicey made the distinction at the time that there was a profound difference between what radicals at the time were arguing about effectively English regional self-government and national self-government. Those are two entirely different things. That was really the point that the campaign for the English Parliament were making. And it's also the point that Robert Toombs, in his monumental history of England and subsequent articles, has made. You're talking about very different things. If you have devolution, Northern Ireland is, again, perhaps the exception here. Is there such a thing as a Northern Irish nation? Well, but if we have the Scottish nation and the Welsh nation, if you give devolved institutions to those nations, then you're not comparing like with like. You can make a democratic argument for regional devolution in England. You can make a democratic argument for English mayoralties. You can make a profoundly democratic argument, as Lord Glasman has made, for all of these modifications, which seem very sensible and attractive to myself, about reinvigorating local government and corporations. But it's not really the same sort of argument that you're making about the nation. That's something different. And I think, again, the point even about the disaffection with English votes for English laws, which is a point that Lord Norton of Louth raised during the debates on this, that really what English votes on English laws seems to give politicians from English constituencies is a veto over certain things, but it doesn't really give them that voice. I mean, it doesn't give them that democratic voice that you have in the institutions in Wales and Scotland. This is something rather different. So I sort of threw in that suggestion that we are at a constitutional moment. And I did that because it is being used in a recent sort of profoundly thoughtful paper by Vernon Bogdaner about where we are now in Brexit. He thinks that there is a constitutional moment. And the way in which I've tried to understand perhaps the transition that is possibly taking place in how politicians at Westminster and elsewhere may engage with this as a constitutional moment is that famous reference that I first came across in Michael Oakeshott to Sir John Cutler's Stockings, which I don't know whether you know that old tale about Sir John Cutler's stockings, that Sir John Cutler had a pair of silk stockings, but he was so mean that every time there was a tear in it, he had them darned in wool, such that after about 20, 30 years, the stockings were no longer silk, but were entirely wool. And it seems to me that English constitutional, or British constitutional reform has been exceptionally good at the darning. The darning, even devolution was a darning of the old fabric. English votes and English laws was a darning of the old fabric. But perhaps we're now at the moment where those constitutional stockings are an entirely different fabric altogether. Now's the time, maybe in a very English way, retrospectively, to acknowledge that, and then to, on the basis of that acknowledgement and that fact, to do something more substantial about it.
Great. I should have mentioned, by the way, that Arthur has written a paper on the Union that I think is it on the Policy Exchange website? Yes. And I think there are summaries of it lying around in the room. Anyway, let's bring the audience in. Who wants to? Gentleman there who spoke earlier, I think, but.
Yes, thank you very much. Just a one point to Lord Murphy, Keith Raffin. And it really is that Wales is, I'm going to make an assertion here, but it's much better integrated into the United Kingdom than Scotland. Obviously, Scotland is a separate educational legal system. But I was just actually looking, as somebody who represented part of North Wales, we never read the Western Mail, the Cardiff Welsh-based paper. We read the Daily Post in my time, called the Liverpool Daily Post. And I'm looking at the website now, it says, North Wales News, Liverpool FC, local news. And basically, North Wales probably looks more across the border into England than it does to South Wales. Just to Lord Glasman, very quickly, is that you're kind of condemning PR, but in Scotland they've managed to have proportional representation. I was a regional member of the Scottish Parliament, and you still had a territorial connection. And I think the importance now is to strengthen local government. We've got far too many one-party states in our local councils. If we really want effective decentralisation, we need to have PR in local government, and Scotland's led the way in this. Wales too.
Should we take a couple more? Yeah. Warwick?
Hi, Warwick Life. I work at Politics Exchange. I do the economics and social policy. I am still very interested in the English dimension of this, and not the sort of misty-eyed versions of how the English have an identity and they may be asserting it or not, but the great difficulty of the United Kingdom and England, which is there's devolution everywhere except within England. So you've got 50-odd million people, or rather more now, whose law policy is driven by the buildings around here, right down to how you formulate and format a menu in a mental health day centre in any part of London or in Cornwall, with inspectors going in to see how that is actually done. And yet it seems to be very, very difficult to generally empower the kind of communities that Lord Glasman was talking about, because all the localism, you have neat, entertaining mayors and elected moments happening, but they all have to conform to the national legislation, the national policy guidance, and the national inspectorates. And there'll be nobody on the ticket who's able to say, for example, I would like to fundamentally reform the 1989 Children Act, or whatever it is. And this seems to me the core difficulty of English devolution and English government in the years ahead.
Well, one more, perhaps?
Somebody at the front.
It's another Policy Exchange person. I was trying to find someone who wasn't a Policy Exchange. You can come in later, John. Well, no, come in now then. Oh, no, there's somebody there who doesn't work at Policy Exchange, as far as I know.
No, I work at the place across the road. I'm the Member of Parliament for Gordon in Scotland. Canada has a Department of Intergovernmental Affairs. Is it about time we had a Department of the Union to strengthen the bonds between the two kingdoms, the Principality and the province? And would that allow to reflect that certain departments in the UK are actually English departments, and certain things are fully devolved and or reserved? And would it strengthen the United Kingdom rather than tear it apart?
Yeah. On the the Western Mail and the Daily Post. One of my predecessors, Peter Walker, who was exiled to Wales by Mrs. Thatcher but enjoyed it thoroughly, he said, when he was leaving the office, at least I haven't got to read the bloody Western Mail anymore. And I'm not making any comment on that, but he had a point. The point is that more people read the Daily Mail and the Daily Mirror in Wales than they do the Western Mail. And there is a case that North Wales looks to the northwest of England, as opposed to South Wales, which looks to nowhere else because it's big enough. But there are differences, of course, between regions of our countries. And I think that was vividly shown in the Brexit referendum, where we found quite stark sub-regional variations in it. And the point you're making earlier about Brexit, of course, Wales voted for Brexit. Scotland and Northern Ireland didn't, but Wales did. So the English argument really goes completely astray on that, because the people in my old constituency who voted overwhelmingly to leave the European Union would be horrified if they were regarded as English. But they wanted to get out of the European Union for various reasons, mainly, I think, probably immigration. With regard to devolution within England, of course, we do have devolution in London. It hasn't got quite the same powers of the Scottish or the Welsh or Northern Ireland parliaments. It's got an awful lot more power than other regions of England has. And it's quite interesting that, the population of London is not far from the combined population, or Great London anyway, of the devolved administration in any event. And so there is that. But the dilemma is there. I mean, unless they resolve this English issue, it will be a continuing problem for people. And I don't think the resolution of that is in the House of Commons, incidentally. Finally, on the department, there's always been a case that people wanted a single department of, I don't know what they call it really, of the Isles at one time it was called, which covered Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland. Then it was absorbed into the Ministry of Justice, although there were still separate territorial secretaries of state. And it was quite difficult to explain to the London media why it was that we had a Welsh secretary and a Northern Ireland secretary and a Scottish secretary whilst they had devolution. The answer is that if you're a unionist and want to preserve the union, those positions, in my view, are absolutely crucial, because it has the link there. You've got people around a cabinet table representing those countries, and of course in Northern Ireland terms it's become much more dramatic. But you've also got the Welsh-Scottish Secretaries of State going back to those countries representing the United Kingdom government. It's a difficult one to understand, but I think that those roles are still crucially important, and I'd be opposed to bringing them together. Their job also, as you mentioned, Whitehall departments, is to ensure that the Whitehall departments are aware of the problems that we get because of devolution and the crises very often between Edinburgh and London and Cardiff and London.
Do you want to?
So, what's required really, just to clarify, and this is in relation to the government department thing, I usually worry when there's a specific department, because then it's not integrated into what's required is a coherent policy of national renewal, and the reintegration of the union is fundamental. So in many ways it's got to go beyond just the nomination of a minister and a single department, and that's the key issue, Warwick, in relation to what you were saying. So just to clarify, what's required is a national system of decentralized institutions. So that's not the way the policy is understood at the moment, and the crucial word there is institutions. Is that it's not just the decimation of the financial institutions, which is everywhere. So if you go to any city, we've got our word today, in the periphery, the dominant institutions on the high street are payday loaners and tattoo parlours. It's a decimated scene, and the conversion essentially of the old banks and the old assembly rooms into restaurants for public sector officials and academics who are working their way back into better jobs. So Italian restaurants on the whole. It's a really desolate scene combined with very divided communities, particularly in South Yorkshire and in Lancashire between Muslims and locals, very divided. So a conceptualisation of a common good is vital in this. So just to think in terms of so when I'm talking about regional banks, the idea that we're putting forward is something called the Banks of England, which would be regulated by the Bank of England, but would constrain the lending of the capital to the specific places involved. So there would be a definite speciality in each of them because of the specific nature of the local economies, but it would be an integrated national system based on endowed institutions. So that's the thing. So you participate within a nation, and I apply this as well to Scotland. I want to reiterate that there have to be sources of power that challenge Edinburgh in Scotland. Absolutely. That's the key point of the areas, and to express the diversity of that nation, and not to be afraid. I don't think we need to be afraid anymore of that Calvinist Catholic division. To embrace the Highlands, the west of Scotland. These are very distinctive political cultures, and they need institutional power. And the second one relates, Warwick, to a national vocational system that's embedded in the economic speciality of those places. So there would be distinctions in those places, but that would involve, substantial educational reform, pathways of 14, the move away from the university as the exclusive goal of higher education, and a reappraisal of the role of manual labour. And then just to clarify in relation to the local assemblies that I'm talking about, is that that wouldn't be, the local assemblies are based on people turning up. It wouldn't be an elected, you would elect people there, but that would be a renewal of forms of direct democracy in this idea of the parish commune. So we're thinking about a renewal of national institutions that work in quite a radically decentralised way. So that's just to clarify, if I didn't get it out straightforwardly the first time.
Good. Okay, let's have a few more. The lady at the back, somebody at the back there. I haven't got my glasses on.
Thank you. It's Charlotte Black is my name. Regarding the repatriation of powers from Brussels, what does the panel think, really, in order to strengthen the union? Would you devolve these immediately, pass them on to Edinburgh, or do you think they should be retained in Westminster for a temporary period, as suggested, in order to ensure the single market of the UK?
And just behind you?
Simon Lee from the Open University. I wonder if the panel would talk about the role of law in the future of the Union, because you have different legal systems in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, England and Wales. We've got a Justice Commission on whether there should be a more separate legal system in Wales. And yet the Supreme Court, which has judges from each of those jurisdictions, seems to be a unifying element, seems to be very popular, isn't elected. About the only people left in the country who criticise the judiciary are Policy Exchange's Judicial Power Project. But otherwise, even the hard left seems to think that they're doing a good job standing up for human rights, and they have just sat in Edinburgh and in Belfast. Is that a model for the future of unionism?
John at the back.
Thank you. John Blake from Policy Exchange. My question relates to, in the wake of the Brexit referendum, I think it became clear to me that not only had the political elite of the United Kingdom not particularly well represented a public that wanted to leave the EU, but actually in the kind of discourse we got about the people who voted to leave, from senior politicians, senior policymakers, senior journalists, some public sector workers, it became apparent they didn't really very much like the provincial English. So it seems to me the problem with lots of these devolution plans is if it's just the case that we take the same people from, say, Westminster and we mail them out to cities in the north, and they can work a bit closer to sort of patronisingly look down on local people and tell them that they're petty and ignorant and they're essentially racist, that we haven't really achieved very much. So how do we deal with having a political class that doesn't seem to like the non-London-based English?
Good point. Who wants to come back on any of those?
I'll leave those.
Yeah?
No, I'll have to say, often when it comes to institutional matters, my eyes glaze over. So I will leave those very interesting questions to my professional colleagues.
My eyes glaze over occasionally too at them, yeah. On Brussels, as I mentioned earlier, that the Welsh Government has actually accepted the United Kingdom Government's final solution, so to speak, on the issue with those powers, the repatriation of powers. I think the compromise which has been arrived at is a fair one, and it does mean that there will be powers repatriated straight away, but others will be frozen and come back eventually. Now, the Scottish Government has decided against that for very different reasons, I suspect, from the Welsh Government, mainly because it's a Scottish nationalist government. That's my view on that. But I think that the compromise we've arrived at is a good one. With regard to the role of law, yes, absolutely right, that the Welsh are now looking at this. Some of the judges are very fond of the idea of having a separate Welsh judiciary, possibly because I guess they rather fancy being the Lord Chief Justice of Wales, who knows. But I think it's more linked, to be honest, that since Wales has been given primary legislative powers, that there is now a body of Welsh law building up. It started obviously with statutory instruments, but now is obviously primary law as well, is that you do need to address that, and that's what the Commission in Wales is looking at the moment. I don't think, to be honest, and Alistair would know better than me in terms of Scotland, whether a separate judicial system or body of law actually goes against the Union in any way. I don't think it did in Northern Ireland. And finally, on the Islington question, about the division within the country. The local government elections of a week or so ago, I thought in a way, they reflected the Brexit referendum, in that we've got a very peculiar and different pattern emerging now between, on the one hand, the cities of our country, particularly this one, and the towns and rural areas of our country, and that the voting patterns that now are emerging post the Brexit decision, the referendum, are very, very different from what I've been accustomed to over my political lifetime. For example, the Mansfields and the Derbys and the Kirklees and places like this in the north of England, which are now voting not for Labour Party but for other parties, Conservatives and others, and they were also very strong Brexit areas too. And so there is a division growing, which is not a division which is what as I said, I've been used to over the years.
Exactly. Yes.
Maurice, more of the
Very unusual.
Blue Labour manifesto from you?
It's not exactly an impartial chair, but you know, those of us who support Brexit are used to it, I think. So, for start, in relation to what Charlotte said, the key thing is to have a vision that bypasses Edinburgh and Cardiff and redistributes that power to the places, to the other places that people live. But we haven't really given any energy to developing that democratic renewal, that vision of democratic renewal in its institutional forms. So it could get blocked into a sort of zero-sum negotiation between Westminster, Edinburgh and Cardiff, and that will be unfortunate. I do think that the ancient constitution provides the basis of which we can think about renewal, which involves not the separation of powers but the balance of interests, and that's the key feature. So I'm a bit of an outlier on this. I'm in for bringing the law lords back into the Lords and making a Parliament the supreme lawmaking body. What we don't want is any form of domination, least of all legal domination, which I think is one of the key features of liberal globalisation. And then the third is just in relation to London. I mean, London really is a civic shanty town. in lots of ways. If you exactly what you said, you know, the whole of Scotland would fit into South London, and that's not including council housing. We don't think about this, but the corporation of the City of London, the representation of money, has monopolised the civic inheritance. So strangely enough, they have intense elections and they represent people. They have a Lord Mayor who, you know, from Mansion House, and they ensure that the interests of finance are fully represented at the level of the British state. One of the things that I would like to see following Brexit is London actually being recognised as a city. I mean, Brighton's a city. I think Wolverhampton's been recognised as a city, but we're still a local authority. It's not a city. And I think that that's a very important part of the renewal of London and the reconstitution of democracy for all of London. Is one of the central projects of reintegrating London into the Union, because there's many poor people in London, but believe me, they don't get a look in anymore, and that's one of the issues. So reconstitution is I guess the concept I'm trying to share with you.
Reconstitution.
Any final thoughts? I ought to just stick up for the judicial power, the Politics Exchange Judicial Power Project, I think. I have no idea why you think that devolving huge amounts of power to the judiciary is extremely popular. And I think examining how that process is happening is a perfectly legitimate project. But that's for another conference, perhaps. One or two very quick ones, or do we have to wind up? It's winding up time. Sorry. Anyway, can we just say another thank you to the panelists up here?